In January 1997, when I was 9 years old, our family experienced a sudden and tragic loss. One afternoon, while tending the tobacco with my father, Uncle John collapsed in the field. He'd been sick for several months but refused to see a doctor. That day, when my father helped him to the clinic near the trading center, they diagnosed him with tuberculosis and told him to go immediately to Kasungu Hospital. Uncle John's pickup wasn't running at the time, so my father ran to borrow a friend's car. Before he left, he placed his brother's bed mat under the cool shade of the acacia tree where he could rest. Uncle John's wife, Anifa, stayed by his side and kept him company, and soon many others from the village joined them. Not long after my father left, I heard a loud commotion under the tree, then panic. It was Anifa who began screaming first. I looked over and saw her push through the crowd, gasping for breath. Others around the tree soon began to wail and cry, holding their arms to heaven. I then felt a hand on my shoulder. I looked up and saw my mother, her face twisted as if she'd bitten something sour. "Your Uncle John is no more," she said. "He has passed." It was then my father returned with the car and learned the tragic news about his brother. Several men had to hold his body up. It was the first time I'd ever seen my parents suffer, and the sight of it frightened me more than any magic ever could. My Uncle John was dead, and his body lay under the acacia tree. I'd never seen a dead person, but I was too afraid to go look, for fear it would never leave my mind. Soon I saw Jeffrey emerge from the crowd. He was crying and walking in circles as if he'd lost his direction. I didn't know how to behave or what to say to him. I wanted to take my cousin and go away, down to the downbow where we could play and I could think. I didn't like the way I was suddenly feeling. You know, in our culture, when a loved one dies, you're expected to wail and cry to properly show your grief. I can't explain why, but I didn't feel like doing this. And after seeing everyone else, especially my father, with his eyes red and face swollen from tears, I began to feel ashamed. So sitting there alone, I forced myself to cry, focusing on my dead uncle, until I could feel the tears run hot down my face. Before they could dry, I went and joined my cousin to show my respect. Later that day, my father's two brothers, Musewali and Socrates, arrived from Kasungu, along with other family and friends who'd heard the news. Members of the church also came to Uncle John's house and stayed all night and the following day. They pressed inside the two rooms and sang, "This world is not my home," while others quietly shuffled in and out to pay their respects. Uncle John's body lay on a grass mat on the floor, covered with a brightly patterned chitenji cloth. The next morning, a simple wooden coffin arrived from Kasungu, and the body was delicately placed inside, yet I never gathered the courage to enter the house myself. January is the rainy season where the air is thick and hot. As more and more people arrived that morning, the house became crowded and sticky, and the sound of people wailing became too much for Jeffrey to handle. At one point, he stepped out, looking even more confused than before, and walked over to where I sat. "Cousin, what next? What will happen?" "I don't know," I said. What could I say? For the rest of the day, Jeffrey would go inside, look at his father's body, then come back out and cry. He did this until it was time for the funeral to begin. Chief Wimby was out of town, so his messenger and bodyguard, Mr. Ngwata, came to the house along with the other village headmen. For hours they sat under the acacia tree and discussed the funeral and what should happen with the family. When a powerful man dies, a lot of work needs to be done. In the event of a problem with the heir or transfer of property, it's the chief who must decide an outcome. Finally, everyone poured out of the house and gathered around the tree. Mr. Ngwata stood and addressed them on behalf of Gilbert's father. "We know this man has left behind some riches, and these treasures include his kids. We'd like to advise his brothers to take full control of these children, make sure they finish their secondary education as they would have if their father had been alive. And in regards to the material wealth, we don't want to hear of troubles in the family as a result. If anyone here wants to help this family, help the children with clothing and school fees." Another person stood up to speak. It was Mr. Jonesy from Kasunga South, speaking on behalf of Jeffrey's mother's side of the family. "This is a sad and tragic time even for our family," he said, holding his hat. "We're very concerned now. The deceased has left behind a wife, our beloved sister Anifa, and her 4 children. Our sister left our family long ago to join this village, so we asked the Kamkwamba side to please care for the kids and finish the job their dear father began. That's all. My father and his brothers then lifted the coffin and placed it inside their friend Kichului's truck. They jumped inside to hold the coffin in place as the truck rolled toward the graveyard. The crowd then followed on foot. The graveyard was located down the trail near Grandpa's village. It was just a small place under a grove of blue gums with tall grass grown up and a few concrete headstones. My father's two sisters, Fanny and Edith, were also laid to rest there. Several men dressed in gumboots were already waiting when everyone arrived. They were the adzukulu, or grave diggers, who are hired to do the job of digging and burying. In Malawi, graves are not just 6 feet deep open pits like those dug in Western countries. Instead, every grave has a hidden compartment at the bottom, usually a smaller cubbyhole carved into the side of the pit where the coffin slides in. It's like having your own little bedroom in death. The purpose is to protect the deceased from falling dirt, or really to keep the family from seeing the falling dirt land on the coffin. For Uncle John's grave, the adzukulu had dug the compartment at the bottom center of the hole, a kind of hole within a hole. Grunting, the adzukulu carefully lowered the coffin with ropes into the smaller compartment. It was the exact size of the coffin. One of the grave diggers then jumped in and covered the hole with wooden planks and a reed mat. With its new floor, the open grave now appeared empty. I watched all of this happen as if in a fevered dream, head throbbing, a dull buzzing deep in my mind, as if the pressing sun overhead had revealed to me its voice. Once the grave was finally filled and covered with grass, I joined the mourners back up the hill. It was the loneliest feeling I'd ever felt. Following Uncle John's death, things became more difficult all around. In addition to the sadness we all experienced, my father had to care for the business alone. It was the start of the growing season, and my father tended the crops through until harvest. He paid all the seasonal workers and settled all the accounts. Then, heeding the advice of the chiefs, he handed the entire business over to John's firstborn son, Jeremiah, who was 20 years old. It's custom for the firstborn son to inherit everything from his father, but it doesn't always work that way. Often, one of the brothers steps in and snatches control, leaving the family of the deceased at his mercy. This unfortunately happens all the time, and it's the number one grievance brought before the village chiefs. Jeremiah lived at home with Jeffrey and their mother and often helped on the farm, but it was well agreed that he didn't like hard work. Although he was very smart, he'd never shown much interest in school and could often be found drinking in the boozing centers. My father felt terribly nervous about handing him the family business, but he wanted no trouble from chiefs or relatives. I don't want anyone saying I'm a thief, my father said. If things go badly, I still did the right thing. Of course, when Jeremiah heard he was being handed a family fortune, he was very surprised. He'd just assumed his father's brothers would never trust him. This is such a wonderful blessing, he told my father. Thank you very much. But as soon as Jeremiah took control, he spent most of the season's profits in the bars of Lilongwe and Kasangu. In November, when it came time to buy seed and fertilizer to plant new maize and tobacco, plus hire a new crew of workers, little of the money was left. As a result, the next crop was smaller, and when the tobacco was sold at auction, Jeremiah took the money and disappeared, returning only after most of it was gone. Uncle John also owned and operated 2 maize mills in nearby villages that made a substantial profit. In addition, he owned 8 head of cattle. The mills and cattle were also given to Jeremiah. But the following year, Musewali, the older brother, forcefully took 1 mill and half the cows. Within 2 years' time, Jeremiah had lost both his maize mill and his cows. As far as my father was concerned, his brother's business was gone. In farming, a man can lose everything so quickly. Given our custom, my father was forbidden to take back what he'd given away. Once you surrender control, you lose it forever. After the business collapsed, our family was left to survive on its own. Farming had also become a tougher business in Malawi thanks to the policies of a new president. In 1994, 3 years before Uncle John's death, President Banda finally retired after losing the first elections he'd allowed to happen. 30 years had been a long time in power, and the people were tired. Opposition against him had also grown ugly. Large crowds had gathered in the cities to protest his tyranny and harsh policies, and riots had erupted as a result. Before the election, Banda's thugs had even attempted to scare people into voting for him again. One day, in the trading center, more than 300 Gulu Wamkulu appeared on the road carrying empty coffins, promising to fill them with anyone who didn't support the life president. But the opposition had still won, and unlike most African losers, Banda agreed to leave quietly and not start a war. He even accepted defeat before the final votes were tallied. He knew it was time. Since Banda had been born and raised in Kasungu, he returned to his home at the base of Mount Nguru, Yanamwamba, formerly the Rock of the Edible Flies, where our great Chua warriors had defeated the Ngoni and lived out his final days. A big, fat former cabinet minister named Bakili Maluzi then became president, bringing with him his own brand of troubles. Banda may have been a cruel dictator, but he did care deeply for farmers and the land. Our district is the most fertile in Malawi, often called the breadbasket of the country, and Banda understood what was required to work the soil. He made sure that the fertilizer was available to every farmer in the country who needed it. Seed was also cheap, allowing any Malawian to grow tobacco to sell. This meant that as long as it continued to rain, no family would go hungry. On the other hand, Maluzi had been a wealthy businessman before entering politics and believed government had no business dealing in fertilizer and seed. He wanted to be different from Banda in every possible way, and this included stopping all subsidies and making the farmers fend for themselves. The free market allowed wealthy companies to flood the auction floors with mass-produced tobacco that drove the prices down and squeezed the small farmer. Soon, the value of our burley tobacco was so low that many farmers didn't bother growing it. My family managed to plant a few small plots in addition to our normal maize fields, but without the help of seasonal workers, it was up to me and my cousins to help keep our farm running. The year after Uncle John died, my Uncle Socrates lost his job as a welder at the Kasungu Flu-Cured Tobacco Authority when the estate closed. He and his family were forced to leave their quarters there and move back to our village, to a large shed near our house. Uncle Socrates had 7 daughters, which was good news for my sisters, but to me, their arrival didn't mean much one way or another. However, as we unloaded their things from the 10-ton lorry, I saw something leap from the truck bed. Out of nowhere, a large dog appeared at my feet. "Get away!" Socrates shouted, kicking the air above the dog's head. It yelped once and scampered off. Once at a safe distance, it sat down and stared at me. "That's our dog, Kamba," he said. "I figured we'd bring him along to watch the chickens and goats here. That's what he did best at the estate. Maybe it'll remind him of home. We'll sure miss it there." Kamba was the most unusual thing I'd ever seen, all white with large black spots across his head and body, as if someone had splattered him with a pail of paint. His eyes were brown and his nose was peppered with bright pink blotches. He looked exotic, like something from another land. Plus, he was big, much taller than the dog around our village, but certainly just as skinny. In Malawi, dogs are kept only for security, and as a result, they aren't fed like their cousins in the West. Malawian dogs eat mice and table scraps when there are any. In all my life, I'd never seen a fat dog. Kamba sat there watching me, his long white tail fanning the dirt behind him. His long tongue hung out the side of his mouth, dripping saliva. As soon as Socrates went inside, Kamba came over and mounted my leg. "Get away," I shouted, making a swatting motion with my hands. The dog scurried against the house. "Go chase some chickens, you stupid animal." His tongue came rolling out again, slobbering on the dirt. Next morning when I awoke, I tripped over something as I stumbled out toward the latrine. There was Kamba, lying square in my doorway, ears perked and waiting. "I thought I told you to leave me alone," I said, then realized what I was doing. I couldn't let anyone catch me talking to animals. They'd think I was mad. Walking back from the toilet, I met Socrates coming out of our house with my father. He smiled and pointed at the dog, now attached to my shadow. "I see you found a friend," he said. "You know, the good Lord blessed me with 7 children, but they're all girls. I think Kamba is happy to have found a pal." "I'm no friend to a dog," I said. Socrates laughed. "Tell him that." After that, I gave up trying to get rid of Kamba. It was no use. And to be honest, he wasn't all that bad. Since I'd never had a dog of my own, it was nice to having someone around, especially someone who didn't talk or tell me what to do. Kamba slept outside my door each night, and when it rained, he'd sneak into my mother's kitchen and curl himself in a corner. And without being told, he'd assumed his job as watchman over the goats and chickens, protecting them from the rare hyena or packs of mobile dogs that wandered wild and ate off the land. He also chased the goats through the compound, causing them to bleat and cry and kick up the dirt. When he did this, my mother would lean out the kitchen and pitch one of her shoes at his head. "Get that dog out of here," she'd shout. It was all a game to Kamba. He constantly tortured the chickens and guinea fowl too, and he even seemed amused when the mother hens flared their wings at him, hissing and giving chase. But above all, what Kamba enjoyed most was hunting. By this time, going hunting in the fields and dambos began to replace many of the games I used to play at home. I'd started by tagging along with my older cousins, like Jeffrey and Charity, who also lived nearby. Mostly we hunted birds. We hid in the tall grass by the dambos, which is so high during the dry season it can swallow a man whole. We'd wait until the afternoons when the birds came there to drink, then positioned a few sticks baited with ulimbo, a sticky sap that worked as a sort of glue. Once the birds stepped onto the stick, they'd get caught and flap around, making all kinds of wild noises. Before they could break free, we'd jump out of the grass with our pangas and shouting, "Tanga, I've got it! Tanga, get it fast so you don't scare off the others. I'll cut its throat." "No, I want to pull off its head." We'd fight over who did the killing, usually taking turns cutting off the bird's head or holding it between our fingers and popping it like a tomato. We'd clean the insides and remove the feathers and store them inside the sugar bags we'd slung around our necks. Once home, we'd make a fire and roast birds on the red embers. Fortunately, our parents never made Jeffrey and I share our hunting meals, and some nights during summer, we'd come home with 8 birds and have quite a feast. My family never had much money, and trapping birds was often our only way of getting meat, which we considered a luxury. The Chichewa language even has a word, nkuli, which means a great hunger for meat. It wasn't easy to satisfy this hunger, and sometimes these missions proved to be treacherous. For one thing, the best ulimbo sap for trapping birds came from the nhazi tree, which grew very thick with branches covered with thorns. One had to squeeze inside the nkazi with his panga and cut the trunk, being careful not to get the sap in his eyes. If he did, he went blind. One afternoon, Charity, Jeffrey, and I were out looking for ulimbo when we spotted the perfect nkazi tree. "I'll go," said Charity. He was kind of a loud guy who always wanted to be the leader, so we let him. Charity climbed into the nkazi tree with his knife, being careful of the sharp thorns all around. He reached up and sliced the trunk, then held a plastic sugar bag against the dripping wound. But just as he was doing this, a great gust of wind shook the entire tree, slinging the ulimbo into his eyes. Charity burst out of the bush, screaming, I'm blind! Help me! It hurts!" "What should we do?" I asked Jeffrey. A man named Maxwell, who once worked for Uncle John, had taught us about the nkazi tree and what to do if sap ever got into our eyes. Jeffrey turned to me. "You remember what Maxwell told us?" "Yeah," I said. "What?" "The only remedy is the milk from a mother." "Oh, where are we going to find that?" "Your house." It was true. My mother had just recently given birth to my sister, Melis. Perhaps she could help. We guided Charity by the shirt and led him to my house. Once there, Jeffrey made our case to my mother, who happily agreed. She instructed Charity to kneel down and open his eyes. She took one breast from her shirt and leaned close to his face. "Hold still," she said, and squeezed a stream of white milk into his eyes. It was hilarious. "Hey, man," Jeffrey shouted, "don't get any in your mouth. This is your payment for satisfying Nkuli," I added, holding my ribs. I never asked Charity how he felt about that incident, but I suppose it didn't matter. Within minutes, he was able to open his eyes and see. We all agreed that Maxwell must be some kind of wizard for knowing this secret. My mother told Charity, "For my services, I get all the birds you kill on your next hunt." Charity agreed. The next day, he brought 4 birds in a sugar sack and dropped them in the kitchen. Hunting with my cousins had taught me the ways of the land, how to find the best spots in the tall grass and along the shimmering dambo pools, how to outwit the birds with a strong, smart trap, and the virtues of patience and silence when lying in wait. Any good hunter knows that patience is the key to the kill, and Kamba seemed to understand this as if he'd been hunting his entire life. Our first outings began with the start of the rainy season, when the showers are heavy all morning and replaced in the afternoon by a sweltering, pasty air. When the land is wet, filled with puddles, the dambos don't attract as many birds. This is when we hunters rely on the chikwapu, a giant deadly whip, or a kind of slingshot trap without the stone. After the rain stopped one morning, Kamba and I set out to make our trap. I carried a sack on the end of my hoe, made from a mpango, a kind of long, brightly colored scarf used by women to hold everything from their hair to babies on their backs. The sack contained a long bicycle tube, a broken bicycle spoke, a short section of steel wire I'd clipped off my mother's clothesline, a handful of maize chaff we called gaga, and 4 heavy bricks. As always, I also carried the 2 hunting knives I'd made myself. The first was a Rambo-style commando knife I'd made from thick iron sheets. First, I traced a fierce-looking pattern on the metal with a pencil. Using a nail and heavy wrench, I poked holes all along the lines, perforating the metal so it popped out with a good pounding. I then ground the metal against a flat rock to smooth the edges and produce a sharp blade. For a handle, I wrapped the bottom of the blade in enough plastic jumbos to get a full, even grip. Then I melted the handle over a fire. My second knife was more like a stabbing tool made from a large nail I pounded flat with the wrench and ground to a sharp edge. I'd fashioned its handle in the same way as the first. I kept both knives tucked snugly in the waistband of my trousers. Packing my gear, I set off with Kamba down the trail behind Jeffrey's house that led to the graveyard, down into the blue gums where the trees were taller and provided good shade. The hills of the Dawa highlands, which separated us from the lake, rose beautifully before me, capped in gray, dripping thunderheads. A new storm was on its way, so we had to work quickly. I found a good spot off the main trail, near a tall blue gum that would cast a long shadow once the sun broke through the haze. Using my hoe, I cleared away grass and vines until the red mud was exposed, a surface of about 4 feet in diameter. Taking my knife, I sawed off 2 thick branches from the blue gum and stripped their bark, then whittled both to sharp points. I pushed the poles into the moist soil about 2 feet apart, then pulled them to test their firmness. They held. I cut the bicycle tube into 2 thin strips and attached both pieces to the section of steel wire. I then tied the rubber strips to the blue gum poles. When finished, it resembled a giant slingshot with a thick steel center. This was the kill bit. Stripping bark off several nearby trees and lashing it together, I fashioned a long rope about 15 feet long. I then cut a small 18-inch section off of it and attached it to the steel bit. I tied a short stick to the other end, making the knot fat and round. Gripping the stick like a handle, I pulled back the rubber bands as far as they'd stretch, then wedged the handle between 2 posts, a second stick and the bike spoke, using the fat, round knot to hold it in place. The long rope then led back into the trees and acted as the trigger. Once it was set, I stacked the 4 bricks several inches in front of the trap, which sprinkled the maize chaff in the middle. This was the kill zone. When the bird landed to eat the chaff, I'd pull the rope and release the sling, slamming the birds into the wall of bricks. "Let's hunt," I said, and Kamba followed me into the trees. We hid behind a small thombozi tree that allowed me to see clearly without being spotted. As soon as we got there, Kamba lay down beside me and stared keenly ahead. He never moved, never barked. After about half an hour, a small flock of 4 birds swooped over and spotted the bait. They fluttered down and began pecking at the dirt. My heart began to race. Kamba's ears perked up and his mouth began to quiver. I was about to release the rope when I saw a 5th bird land just behind the others. It was giant, with a fat gray chest and yellow feathers. "Come on," I thought, "a little more to the right. That's it, come on." After a few long seconds, the fat bird nudged its way into the group and started to feed. Once they were square in the kill zone, I pulled the rope. Whoop-pop! The birds disappeared in a cloud of feathers and chaff. "Tonga!" I shouted, and Kamba and I dashed out of our blind. 4 birds lay dead against the bricks, while the 5th had managed to fly away. The large bird was still flapping against the mud, so I picked it up before it revived. Its body was warm and soft in my hands. I could feel its tiny heart fluttering against my palm. I pinched its head between my 2 fingers and twisted its neck. I picked up the others and dusted off the mud. Normally I'd carry a sugar bag, but today I'd forgotten. I stuffed the limp birds into my pockets. Once the trap was reset, I waited for another half hour, then finally gave up. It's time to eat, I said. Kamba and I then set off for Mfala. Mfala means a home for unmarried boys, which is exactly where my cousin Charity lived. It was more like a clubhouse, situated on our property just across from Jeffrey's house. James, the seasonal worker who'd fought Fury, once lived there. But after he'd been laid off, it remained empty. Charity had taken over the house with his friend Mizek, a big fat guy who'd dropped out of school and now worked as a trader. Although they both still lived with their parents, Charity's house was near Gilbert's in the Blue Gum Grove. They slept at the clubhouse at night. In the corner, someone had built a bed from blue gum poles and maize sacks stuffed with grass. Dirty clothes were strewn everywhere, along with mango peels and groundnut shells and other strange pieces of rubbish. One wall featured a poster of a soccer club, MTL Wanderers, otherwise known as the Nomads, which were my favorite team in the Malawi Super League, and possibly the whole world. A poster of their chief rivals, Big Bullets, adorned the opposite wall, and I can't tell you how much I hated Big Bullets. A fireplace sat in the corner, just a large shallow pot with holes poked in the sides for ventilation and filled with charred maize piths and wood. A small window above ventilated the smoke, but not very well. It also let in the room's only light, a thin beam of sunshine that was polluted with hanging dust. The air stank like dirty feet. To me, it was the greatest place in the world. Because I was young and annoying, I was mostly forbidden from entering the clubhouse, unless, of course, I earned my entry. A few times I was allowed in after helping steal mangoes. Charity would make me wear a mpango sack around my neck and sneak into the neighbor's compound. With my knife in my teeth, I'd climb the trees and quietly snip the mangoes and drop them into the sack. I'd take them back to the Impala and they'd let me inside. It was like paying dues. Once inside, the conversation was lurid and often confusing for my 11-year-old mind. Much of the talk was about girls, and I was lucky if they forgot I was there. One time, Mizek dropped midway through a story about a certain girl he'd seen in town and said to Charity, "We should take care. We have a child among us. This boy can't handle such stories." I started pleading. "I'm not a child. Come on, guys, carry on. I'm a big man. I know some things about girls." "Oh, yeah? And what do you know?" I know what you know." As Kamba and I walked home from the hunt, I knew I'd earned enough loot to gain myself an entry. As I got close, I heard Charity and Mizek inside. I knocked, and Charity swung open the door. "What?" "Guys, I got 4 birds just now. They're here in my pockets. Can I come in?" Mizek appeared at the door. "What do you have for us?" 4 birds." He smiled. "This is the type of man we need here at Mfala. Good job." "We'll make a fire," said Charity. I walked inside beaming. Kamba followed. "Get that stupid dog out of here," shouted Mizek. "He's going to think he lives here or something. Dogs don't belong inside. Don't you know this? I bet you even talk to that thing." "Kamba," I screamed. "Get outside." I reared back my leg and he scurried out the door, then looked at me confused. "Just wait," I whispered. I began cleaning my birds, plucking off the feathers and shaking them from my fingers into a pail. I popped the heads off and scooped out the entrails. When I opened the door, Kamba was waiting. This was his hunting treat, a reward more treasured than life itself. I tossed each head into the air, and Kamba leaped up and grabbed them. One crunch, and they were gone. The entrails were slurped in a gulp. Back inside, Charity and Mizek already had the birds laid over the coals. The sizzling meat smelled delicious. "Guys," I said, "I'm really starting to salivate." "Be quiet." Once they finished cooking the birds, they even allowed me to eat one. But as soon as I was no longer useful to them, the inevitable happened. "Hey, boy," said Mizek, "don't I hear your mother calling?" "What? I don't hear anything." "He's right," said Charity. "That's definitely your mother." My marching orders had been given. Without protest, I holstered my knife back into my waistband, called my dog, and together we returned to a house full of girls.